The gravel road up to Coldwater Pass has gotten worse with age, same as him. He feels every rut through the truck's old suspension, every stone the tires kick up against the wheel wells, and he thinks, not for the first time, that a road like this either keeps people out or tests the ones who mean to stay. It tested him once. He was 22 the first time he drove it, though back then he hadn't been driving anything. He'd been walking, boots soaked through, a shoulder bag holding everything he owned in the world slung crosswise over his chest, like it might blow away if he didn't hold it tight. He parks where the cobblestones start, same as always, because even now, decades later, something in him refuses to drive over that old stone road. Some places you're supposed to walk into. He reaches for the cane, leaning against the passenger seat, and for a moment he just sits there, engine ticking as it cools, snow starting to needle against the windshield the way it did that first winter. He was orphaned young, bounced through more houses than he could count by the time the state cut him loose at 18, and after that it was just towns, a season here, a season there, wherever there was work that didn't ask too many questions about where a person came from. By the winter of 1991, he'd been drifting almost 4 years, and Coldwater Pass wasn't a destination so much as a place he ended up, because the last town had run out of reasons to keep him, and the next one was still 50 miles off. He steps out of the truck now, cane sinking a little into the snow, and the cold hits him the same way it did back then. Not cruel exactly, just honest. Mountain cold doesn't pretend to be anything else. He remembers the hunger in his legs that day, the kind that isn't about food, but about needing somewhere to stop. He remembers the cobblestones underfoot, half buried in drift, clearly laid by someone who'd meant for this road to last, meant for people to keep coming this way long after they were gone. He remembers wondering, even then, half frozen and running on nothing, who builds a road like that into nowhere? He starts walking now, slower than he'd like, cane finding the old stones beneath the snow, like it remembers the path, even if his eyes have gone soft at the edges. Ahead the valley opens the way it always has, silent and white, and somewhere past that bend the trees will thin and the mountain will show itself, and he'll see, for what he suspects might be the last time, the place that changed everything. But that first day, he hadn't known any of that yet. That first day, he'd just been looking for a place to get out of the wind. That first day, the light had already started dying by the time he rounded the bend where the valley narrowed. 22 years old and running on nothing but a boiled potato from the morning and whatever heat his body could scrape together from walking, he'd stopped believing in luck sometime around Nebraska. But he still believed in roads, because roads went somewhere, and somewhere was better than the ditch he'd been sleeping in the night before. The cobblestones kept pulling him forward, even after his legs told him to quit. He remembers thinking that a road laid stone by hands that clearly cared whether it lasted, had to lead to something worth the trouble. Nobody paved a mountain path for nothing. Then the trees thinned, the way they had for him just now, decades later and slower on his feet, and the mountain showed its face. Gray rock streaked white with old snow, a dark seam of shadow where the stone folded in on itself. And tucked right up against that shadow, so close it seemed to be growing out of the rock, sat a cottage. It was small, squat stone walls, a roof gone soft with drift, a chimney standing crooked against the sky, and no smoke. He remembers that detail landing on him like a stone dropped into water, the absence of it, the stillness where there should have been life. A home with no smoke in weather like that wasn't sleeping. It was empty, or it was dead, and either way it meant nobody would come out swinging a shotgun if he got closer. He'd stood there a long moment, just looking, the wind cutting through his coat like it had a personal grudge, and something in him, some old, tired part that had learned the hard way not to trust anything that looked too easy, told him to keep walking. But his legs had other ideas. His legs had decided, somewhere back around that last frozen mile, that this was as far as they were willing to carry him without a fire. So he went toward it, slow, watching the windows for movement, listening for a dog, a voice, anything that might mean the place wasn't his to try. Snow had drifted waist-high against the north wall, untouched, no footprints breaking its surface but the ones he was leaving. The door hung slightly open, frozen in that gap by ice and time, and beyond it he could see nothing but dark. He remembers the strange shape of the cottage more than anything, how it wasn't just built near the mountain but seemed built into it, the back wall vanishing into stone, like the house had been grown rather than raised. He didn't understand it then. He only understood that the wind had stopped screaming in his ears the moment he stepped into its shadow, and that was enough reason, cold and desperate as he was, to push that door the rest of the way open and see what waited inside. The door gave with a groan that sounded almost human, like the cottage itself was clearing its throat after years of silence. He put his shoulder into it, once, twice, and on the third try the ice sheeting the hinges cracked loose, and the door swung wide enough for him to slip through sideways, dragging his bag behind him. Inside, the cold was different. Not the biting, moving cold of the valley, but something older, settled, the kind that comes from a room sealed away from wind and weather both. Dust hung thick in the gray light. A table sat near the far wall, 2 chairs pushed in as though someone meant to come back for supper. A shelf held tin cans gone soft with rust, their labels long faded to nothing. Everything wore the same pale coat of neglect, undisturbed, patient, waiting for a hand that hadn't come in years. He should have felt like an intruder. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, the kind that makes your knees go weak once you finally stop pretending you're not exhausted. He checked the walls first, old habit, the kind you learn quick when you've slept in enough places that weren't meant for sleeping. No rot in the timber. No give in the floor. Whoever built this place had built it to last, stone laid tight and true, joints packed with a mortar that had held despite decades of freeze and thaw. It humbled him a little, how solid it still was, like the cottage had simply been waiting for someone worth the trouble. The hearth took up most of the back wall, wide and black with old soot, and it was there, crouching to check the flue for blockage, that he noticed it. A gap in the stone just beside the firebox, narrow, deliberate, unlike the rest of the wall's careful joinery. Not a crack. A passage. Cut clean into the rock, angling backward into darkness, disappearing into the mountain the cottage had been built against. He sat back on his heels and stared at it a long moment, breath fogging in front of him. A house didn't need a tunnel behind its fireplace. Not unless someone had a reason. But his hands were half frozen and his stomach was hollow enough to ache, and even a mystery like that would have to wait its turn behind fire and food and 4 solid walls. He told himself that. He told himself it firmly, the way you tell yourself things you don't quite believe. Still, before he did anything else, before he cleared the hearth, before he checked the window hanging cracked and useless in its frame, before he even unpacked what little he owned, he found himself reaching into the passage, feeling along the stone for a draft, a current of air, anything. And there it was, faint, cool, moving, something breathing on the other side of that darkness. He pulled his hand back slow, like he'd touched something alive, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the cold didn't feel like the only thing waiting for him that night. I've thought about that draft since, more times than I can count, and I still don't know why the first thing I did was close it back up. Not seal it, just pull a loose board over the opening, lean it there like a curtain and turn my back on it. Maybe I already understood that a man can only carry so much wonder before he needs a fire more than an answer. The chimney was the first real fight. Something had nested in there years before, sticks and old leaves packed tight enough that when I finally worked a length of green branch up through the flue, a season's worth of debris came raining down onto the hearthstone in a black, choking cloud. I coughed until my eyes ran. I kept at it anyway, because a house with a blocked chimney is just a cold box with pretensions, and I had spent enough nights in cold boxes to know the difference mattered. By the second afternoon, I had draft moving clean through the flue, and I built my first fire small and careful, the way you build a fire when you're not sure the chimney will behave, when you're listening for smoke curling back into the room instead of climbing up and away into that gray mountain sky. It drew beautiful. I sat on the hearthstone with my palms out toward it longer than I probably needed to, just feeling my fingers come back to life one knuckle at a time. The window took longer. The frame had swollen and cracked with some old winter's freeze, and the glass that remained was more spiderweb than pane. I found a scrap of oiled canvas in my bag, cut it down, tacked it snug enough to break the wind while I figured out something better. It wasn't glass. It wasn't even close to glass. But it held, and that first night, with the fire going and the wind muffled instead of howling straight through the room, the cottage stopped feeling like a ruin I was trespassing in and started feeling, just barely, like a place a person could survive. I slept in front of that fire wrapped in everything I owned, and I woke twice in the night thinking I'd heard something move behind the hearth, a settling of stone, a shift of air, before telling myself it was only the wind finding some new gap to complain through. I didn't go near the loose board again, not that night. But I thought about the draft, that cool, moving breath from somewhere deep in the mountain, patient as anything, waiting behind a piece of scrap wood I'd propped there myself. Whatever built that passage hadn't built it for nothing. Nobody cuts stone by hand, in a place this remote, without a reason worth the labor. I told myself I'd look come morning, once the fire had burned down to coals I trusted, once I'd eaten something warm for the first time in 3 days. I told myself a lot of things that week. Most of them, it turned out, were just me working up the courage to go back through that door in the wall. Morning came gray and thin through the mended window, the kind of light that makes a man believe he's braver than he is. I ate the last of the crackers I'd been rationing, drank water warmed at the fire, and told myself there was no sense putting off what curiosity had already decided for me. I pried the board away from the hearth wall with the same care I'd used setting it, half expecting the mountain to object. It didn't. The passage breathed out at me, cool and steady, smelling of wet stone and something faintly mineral, like a well that had never seen the sun. I lit the stub of candle I'd found in a drawer and went in low, one hand on the wall, boots scraping on rock worn smooth by feet that weren't mine. The passage narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again, and I lost count of the turns before the candlelight gave out on emptiness ahead of me. Not a wall, but air. Open air, going up and out farther than my small flame could reach. I stepped through, and the sound of my own breathing changed, went thin and echoing, and I understood before I could see it that I'd walked into something enormous. I found a lantern hook first, rusted but solid, driven into stone at shoulder height, and beside it a shelf, not natural, Not something water or time had carved, but cut deliberate and square into the rock, the marks of a chisel still visible if you ran a thumb across them. There were more shelves beyond that, a whole wall of them, empty now, but built by someone who'd meant to keep coming back. My eyes adjusted enough to make out a walkway of gray, weathered planks laid across the uneven cave floor, boards silvered with age but still holding together, still bearing weight when I tested them with a boot before trusting them with my whole self. They led off into the dark like a road nobody had walked in years. And under all of it, beneath the sound of my own boots and my own held breath, I heard water, not dripping, moving, a living sound, patient and constant, coming from somewhere ahead where the walkway bent out of sight. I followed it. The candle guttered once, and I nearly lost my nerve, cupping my hand around the flame until it steadied, and when I came around the bend I found the spring, a wide black pool of water, so still and clear it caught the candlelight and threw it back doubled, fed from some vein deep in the rock, cold enough that my breath fogged just standing near it. I stood there a long time, candle trembling slightly in my hand, thinking of the empty shelves, the built walkway, the hook waiting for a lantern that had long since rusted through. Someone had made a life out of this darkness once. And standing in the hush of that great stone room, I wanted, badly, to understand why. I've told people since that I could have turned back right there, found what I needed, warmed myself, called it enough. But I was 22 and half-starved for a story bigger than my own, and something about that pool, the deliberateness of it, the care in the carved shelves, pulled me on past where sense would have stopped me. The walkway kept going past the spring, hugging the wall where the stone had been worn smooth by boots that weren't mine. I found a second chamber, smaller, dry, and it took my breath clean out of me when the candle finally lit the whole of it. Shelves again, but these weren't empty. Tin cans gone to rust at the seams, sacks of something long since turned to dust inside their burlap, coils of rope hard as iron, a crate of tools I could still make out by shape, a froe, a draw knife, a hand auger, all laid in rows like a man had set them down expecting to pick them up again the next morning. Nobody had. I moved slow through that room, touching things I had no right to touch yet, feeling less like a trespasser with every step, and more like a man being handed something he hadn't earned. In the back corner, under a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff with age, I found a trunk. Iron-banded, padlocked, small enough to carry but heavy enough I didn't try. I worked the lock with a bent nail and the patience of someone who'd broken into worse things for worse reasons, and when it finally gave and the lid creaked back, I found paper. Not money. Not gold, though God knows some fool part of me had hoped. Journals, a dozen of them at least, bound in leather gone soft and dark, the pages inside brittle but whole, filled edge to edge with a small, careful hand. I held the candle close enough to singe my knuckles and read the first line I could make out. October. The spring runs colder this year than last, and the meat keeps well past what I'd have guessed. I sat down right there on the cold stone floor, coat still dripping melted snow down my collar, and I read until the candle burned to a stub in my fingers. Whoever had lived in that cottage hadn't just sheltered here. They'd worked this place, studied it, kept records of it like a man tending a garden nobody else knew existed. There were dates going back further than I could account for, notes on temperature, on air moving through the rock like it had somewhere to go, on shelves built and rebuilt to hold more. I lit a second candle off the first before it died, because I wasn't ready to leave that room in the dark, not yet. not with a caretaker's whole buried life spread open in my lap and a mountain still holding its breath around me, waiting, it seemed, for someone to finally ask it the right question. I want to tell you what those pages held, because I've carried them in my head longer than I carried anything else from that winter. The old caretaker, I never did learn a full name, only initials scratched at the bottom of certain entries, a careful E.H. Like a signature he was proud of, had figured out something about that mountain that nobody in Coldwater Pass seemed to remember by the time I got there. He'd mapped how the air moved through the rock, cold currents sinking down from some crack higher up, pooling in the lower chambers no matter the season. He wrote about testing it with candle smoke, watching which way it bent and drifted, marking the walls with chalk where the cold ran strongest. He built shelves in those spots. He hauled down sides of beef, wheels of cheese, barrels of apples, and they kept through summers hot enough to wilt hay in the valley below, kept for ranches 3 and 4 miles off who paid him in coin or trade or nothing at all when times were lean. He wasn't just living in that cave. He was running an ice house older than electricity, older than half the roads I'd walked to get there, and doing it alone. There were names of ranch families in those pages too, though I didn't recognize any of them yet. That would come later, when I started asking around town and watching old men's faces change at the mention of the cottage. But that night I only cared about the mountain itself, about what else it might be hiding. Near the back of the last journal, tucked so flat against the binding I almost missed it, I found a folded square of paper gone soft as cloth. I opened it with more care than I'd have used on my own skin. A map, hand-drawn, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. It showed the chambers I'd already found, the spring, the shelves, the walkway I'd crossed to get there, but past them, deeper into the mountain, the caretaker had sketched another passage, a narrow throat of rock, marked with small, careful hatching, leading to something he'd labeled only with 3 words, underlined twice like he wanted to be sure whoever found it wouldn't skim past. The warm room. Nothing else. No explanation, no date near it. No note in the margins about what he meant or how he'd found it. I sat there with the candle guttering low again, my knees stiff from the cold floor, staring at those 3 words until they didn't look like words anymore, just shapes cut into paper by a hand that had known this mountain better than it knew itself. I thought about the wind I'd felt moving through that narrow stone passage on my way in, how it hadn't felt like it was coming from outside at all. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay on the cot with the map folded against my chest, like it might slip away if I let go of it, and I listened to the mountain breathe. That's the only way I know to say it. Somewhere in the dark beyond the storeroom, air was moving through stone, and it had a rhythm to it if you lay still long enough to notice. A slow push and pull, like the whole cave had lungs. Morning didn't mean much down there, but I waited until I figured the sun was up outside before I gathered what I needed. Rope, the good lantern, filled to the top, a crowbar for whatever rockfall I might meet. I ate cold beans standing up because my hands were too eager to sit still. The passage the caretaker had marked wasn't where I expected. I had to backtrack twice, holding the map close to the lantern, matching the hatch marks to shapes in the rock that all looked the same until suddenly one of them didn't. A gap low to the ground, barely wider than my shoulders, breathed cold air steady as a held note. I went in on my knees at first, then bent double, the ceiling dropping until I was nearly crawling with the lantern pushed ahead of me. Twice I met rockfall, small stuff, loose shale that had come down sometime in the years since anyone walked this way, and I cleared it by hand, stacking pieces behind me so I wouldn't lose the path back. Once I found a stretch of old walkway boards, rotted through in the middle, and I had to test each one with the crowbar before I trusted my weight to it. One gave way entirely. I stood there a long moment, listening to it clatter down into some drop I couldn't see the bottom of, and I thought about how easy it would be to disappear down here and never be found, and how nobody would come looking. I kept going anyway. The passage narrowed one more time, tight enough that I had to turn sideways and feed the lantern through ahead of me, and then it opened. Not slowly. All at once, the way a held breath lets go. The lantern light spread out into a space bigger than the walkway chamber, bigger than anything I'd found yet, and the air hit me warm, actually warm, damp against my face after weeks of breathing cold stone. Steam curled up off dark water, pooled across most of the chamber floor, catching the light and scattering it against a ceiling studded with pale mineral formations, like something grown rather than built. The water didn't move except where it lapped gentle against the rock edges, and it glowed faint gold where the lantern touched it. I stood there at the edge of it, with the crowbar still in my hand, forgetting to breathe, forgetting the cold I'd carried in from outside, forgetting for one long moment that I had ever been anything but exactly where I was standing. I didn't touch that water the first night. I sat with it a long while, the way you sit with something you don't quite trust yet, and then I went back up through the passage and let the cold outside remind me what season it actually was. But I came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the third day I understood the pool wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I, not for a good while yet. So I got to work. I started with the walkways because they were the bones of the whole place, and bones have to be sound before anything else matters. The old boards were split in places, soft with rot in others, and I pulled them up plank by plank, testing each one under my boot before I decided its fate. Some I saved and sanded smooth again. Others I replaced with fresh-cut lumber I hauled down from a stand of pine near the cottage, notching the new wood to match the old joinery as close as I could manage, because whoever built those walkways first had known what they were doing, and I wasn't about to improve on it out of pride. The shelving took longer. Years of damp had warped the carved rock ledge's wooden supports, and a few had given way entirely, dumping jars and tools into the dark. I reset the anchors, shimmed what needed shimming, and went through every crate and shelf twice, once to clean, once to catalog, the way the journals had taught me a caretaker ought to. The spring itself needed clearing too. Silt and fallen stone choked up along one edge, and I spent 2 full days on my knees in that cold water, with my sleeves rolled to the shoulder, scooping out debris until the current ran clean and quick again, singing against the rock the way I imagined it must have sung decades before. Above ground, the cottage demanded just as much. The roof had a soft spot near the chimney where snowmelt had been finding its way in for longer than I wanted to think about, and I spent a week up there in the cold with borrowed shingles and a prayer that the weather would hold. Stone by stone I repointed the mortar along the north wall, where frost had worked its fingers in, and pried gaps wide enough to whistle through at night. Every room got its turn, swept, scrubbed, mended, until the place stopped feeling like something I was only passing through, and started feeling like something I was keeping. By the time the worst of the cold broke, my hands were scarred and calloused in new places, and the cottage stood tighter than it probably had in 20 years. But there was still the matter of that hidden pool, and the map, and the question of what exactly the old caretaker had meant it for. I hadn't gone looking for company that spring. I'd gone looking for nails, mostly, and a length of stovepipe I couldn't fashion myself, and that meant a wagon ride down to the trading post at Coldwater Pass, where a man named Hollis kept a ledger and a suspicious eye on drifters. I told him, plain as I could, about the cave, the cold air that never wavered no matter the season, the shelves cut into rock that could hold a winter's worth of meat without a lick of ice. He didn't believe me until his brother-in-law, a rancher named Dutch, who'd lost half a beef to spoilage the year before, rode up to see for himself. Dutch stood in that first chamber with his hat in his hands, breath fogging in air that stayed a steady chill no matter what the mountain was doing outside, and he didn't say much. He just nodded, the way careful men do when they've decided something. A week later he brought 2 sides of beef, some cheese wheels wrapped in cloth, and a promise. He'd bring more, regular, if I'd keep them cold and keep them safe. In trade he left flour, coffee, a coil of good rope, and a used axe head sharper than mine. Word does what water does in a place like that, finds the low ground and spreads. Soon there were others. A widow with preserves she couldn't move fast enough before they turned. A trapper who needed a dry, cool place for pelts between trips to town. A family passing through on their way to somewhere else, stranded a night by weather, glad enough to pay for a warm floor by the fire and eggs in the morning. I never charged much. I didn't know how, not being a man of business, and besides, most of what came my way wasn't cash. It was lumber, tools, seed, things a place needed more than coins ever could. I kept a ledger of my own, in the back pages of one of the caretaker's old journals, tallying who owed what and who I owed in turn. It felt strange at first, being trusted with anything. Nobody had handed me responsibility before without expecting me to lose it or ruin it. But the cave held its cold, the cottage held its warmth, and slowly the valley learned my name the way I'd learned the mountain's secrets, one careful exchange at a time. By midsummer there were regular footprints on the cobblestone road that hadn't been there in years, and smoke rising steady from my chimney, where once there'd been nothing but silence and drifted snow. I still hadn't found the courage, or the daylight hours, to follow that hand-drawn map any deeper than I already had. But something in me knew the mountain wasn't finished, showing me what it kept. Years have a way of folding into each other when you're building something instead of just surviving it. I blinked, and it was 3 winters gone, then 5, then I stopped counting the way I once counted coins in my pocket, because there was no need. The cottage had a second room by then, framed with lumber I'd traded for cold storage, and the roof didn't leak, and the fireplace I'd first coaxed back to life with numb fingers had a proper stone hearth I'd laid myself, one careful course at a time. The cave walkways were solid underfoot, rope rails bolted where the old caretaker had only strung twine. I'd widened the passage where the ceiling dropped low enough to bruise a man's skull, shored it with timber the way the journals taught me, though I improved on his methods where I could. The warm pool chamber had a bench now, cut and fitted, and travelers who knew to ask for it left something extra in trade. It was a boy who came up the cobblestone road one October, thin the way I'd been thin, carrying nothing but a coat too light for the altitude, and a look I recognized because I'd worn it myself. I didn't ask him much. I fed him first, the way the cottage had never fed me until I fed myself, and let him sleep by the fire before I asked a single question about where he'd come from or where he thought he was going. He didn't have an answer, same as I hadn't. So I gave him work instead of answers, because work was the only language I trusted to say what I meant. I taught him to read the cave's cold breath, the way the caretaker's pages had taught me, showed him which shelves held what through which seasons, walked him past the spring and the walkways until his boots knew the path without his eyes. He was clumsy with tools at first, the way I'd been, and patient the way I'd had to learn to be. Some nights he'd ask why I'd taken him in at all, a stranger off the road, and I never had a clean answer for that either, only that someone had left a cottage standing for me to find, and it seemed a poor way to honor that if I let the door close behind me alone. When I finally set the journals in his hands, the caretaker's original pages, and my own added in the back, ledgers and repairs and seasons logged in my own crooked hand, I told him what I'd never been told myself, that a place like this doesn't belong to any one man. It only ever belongs to whoever's willing to keep it standing for the next one who comes up that frozen road with nothing. The road up to the cottage is harder on my knees now than it ever was on my boots back then. I stood at the bend where the cobblestones first show themselves through the snow, same as they did that first winter, and I let myself feel every one of the years between that boy and this old man before I climbed the rest of the way. He was waiting at the door. Grown now, shoulders filled out, hands scarred from the same work that scarred mine, a beard he probably didn't have when I first found him wandering the pass with nothing but a duffel and a bad attitude toward the cold. He didn't say much, he never did. He just stepped aside and let me walk into the front room one more time. The fireplace was cold, the way it had been that first night decades ago. I knelt down slower than I used to, and laid the kindling the way I'd laid it 1,000 times since, and I struck the match, and I watched the flame catch and climb and start to breathe warmth back into stones that had been holding heat and losing it for longer than either of us had been alive. I set the journals on the mantel where they'd always lived, the caretaker's pages, gone brittle and brown at the edges, my own, added on through winters and summers I could still name if I tried, and beneath them a third hand now, his, logging seasons and repairs the way I'd taught him, the way the caretaker had never lived long enough to teach me himself. I told him the cottage was his, not a loan, not an arrangement, his, deed and all, filed proper down at the county office the week before. He argued a little the way I had when the old caretaker's kin had finally tracked me down years back and told me the same thing. I let him argue. Then I told him what I'd told myself the day I signed those papers, that a place doesn't get to rest just because the man who saved it gets old. It needs someone standing in the doorway with tools in his hands and no home to go home to. We sat by the fire a long while, not talking much, listening to the cave breathe its cold air through the passage behind the hearth. Same sound it's made every winter since the mountain first hollowed itself out for whoever needed it. I thought about the boy who'd walked up that frozen road with nothing, looking only for a roof and a night out of the wind, and how the mountain had given him so much more than that. A spring, a warm pool, a livelihood, a life. The fire held steady. The cottage held steady, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that some things, built right and tended well, simply go on.